The Defense Logistics Agency basically buys its medication for the U.S. military from the same commercial market that gets its raw materials from foreign and geographically concentrated sources. Ms. Raghavendran, how at risk is the United States, for example, if another pandemic or a major earthquake or flood or other natural disaster hits where these drugs are sourced?
Thank you, Chairman Peters, for that question, and also again for the opportunity to be here today. Our analysis suggests there is significant reliance on foreign sources when you look at finished dose forms and active pharmaceutical ingredients, and more for the latter than the former. There are some blind spots in this picture, though, which I will explain. When you examine facility and product registration counts, we see that the concentration is predominantly in India, lesser extent in Europe, and then followed by China. But what we have to keep in mind is that these are counts of facilities and product registrations. What it doesn't take into account is volume. So the volume could be concentrated in one facility among many, and we don't know that picture. Where we're flying completely blind is in our understanding of where the key raw chemicals that go into making the active ingredient come from. We have some anecdotal evidence, but we really have no systematic understanding.
Thank you. Dr. Fox, the Defense Department told my staff that with the exception of just 3 drugs, the DLA is not able to assess with certainty whether any of the other drugs it purchases rely solely on sources from either China or India. So given this blind spot, as was mentioned in the previous comments, what would happen to veterans, to military personnel, and to the U.S. healthcare system at large if these raw materials, including those sourced from China and India, simply became unavailable?
We would have significant shortages. And that's a little bit about what we have today, where our the DoD and our military are relying on the same commercial market as hospitals.
So the report that I released today and that Dr. Goodman referenced finds that our lack of supply chain visibility is basically a national security risk, and it persists at a time when active shortages that we are seeing today are actually on the rise. The COVID-19 pandemic only exacerbated this problem. So Dr. Fox, the FDA created the Essential Medicines List in 2020, but in your testimony you note that this list should not be the starting point for determining which drug supply chains are most vulnerable because, I think, quote, it is not comprehensive for essential medical care, quoting your testimony today. Why is this so, and what should the federal government be doing differently?
Thank you for that question. You know, the government really needs to assess which products truly have a vulnerable supply chain. As my colleague mentioned, there may be very concentrated sources of key starting materials that it could look like we have a broad supply chain with maybe 5 to 6 manufacturers of something, but if each one of those companies is relying on a single key starting material that's only available in China or India, we simply don't know that. So we need to do more work to truly assess where the key vulnerabilities are. And FDA's essential medications list was not developed for that purpose. And in fact, it includes medications like filgrastim that have a very hardened manufacturing process where they could basically operate off the grid without any water, without any power, and they would still be producing filgrastim. And so we really need to target the true vulnerable products.
Dr. Schumann, we have data on drug shortages, but data on the impact of these shortages, especially on patient care, is unfortunately very, very limited. For example, a 2010 shortage resulted in pediatric Hodgkin's lymphoma patients receiving medication substitutions that unfortunately turned out to be less effective, as well as increasing complications for the delivery of that drug. If you could please, for the committee, describe the impact that you have seen from your work at the University of Michigan Medical School and what Congress should be aware of that isn't right now being captured by just looking at the data.
Thank you for that question, Senator. So you're absolutely right. One of the challenges of drug shortages is that it requires hospitals to essentially MacGyver different treatment opportunities and regimens, which is not necessarily evidence or data-based. So as an example, the Hodgkin's lymphoma drug was not available, and as a result, very well-meaning oncologists switched to a different chemotherapeutic drug. The analogy that I'll use is when you're baking, you have a list of ingredients, and you need that list to be exactly what it is in order to have an end product. When you make a substitution, and you don't necessarily know how well that is going to work, the problem is you're not going to end up with a dry cake, you're going to end up with a child whose cancer hasn't been cured. That is a prescient example of where we are and where we have been going. I can speak more about impact on VA and current at your discretion, sir.
Well, we'll do that, but just in my final question to you, as we look at these drug shortages, clearly it has a big impact on a major medical center like the University of Michigan, but talk to me about the impact of smaller, less resourced hospitals, which is the majority of hospitals out there around the country.
You're absolutely right, sir. The major issue here is the disparities that exist. At major institutions, we have more staff and resources in order to anticipate and mitigate shortages, to make sure that we have enough product, conserve it, obtain it from other sources. Smaller institutions simply don't have that. What that creates is situations in which smaller hospitals may not know what the supply may look like elsewhere. They may be making rationing decisions that are not necessarily consonant with national guidelines or with what hospitals down the street are doing. For example, when we are short on a medication at Michigan Medicine, I have absolutely no idea what that supply looks like or what the workflow looks like at hospitals across the state. That begets disparities, that treats people unfairly, whether that's poor people in Detroit or whether that's people in a rural hospital in northern Michigan. They are suffering in ways that we can't even necessarily know.
So I think this is an important issue that we have to really drill down on, so a little bit more clarification on it and picking up on the questions that Ranking Member Paul has. When he says that we have sticky prices that can't go up, that's because there are contracts, the Medicare contracts and others, which is part of capitalism. If you're a really big customer, you will negotiate for a price. That's pure capitalism, and then you lock into a contract to do that, which is part of the market. But is that the reason why we're seeing shortages? Is because we have big customers locking in contracts for a price? You know, I'm a little concerned. In fact, in our report, the fludarabine is a drug that had a shortage here, and I see once it was in shortage, it was less than $300 a vial. Then all of a sudden, the manufacturer raised it to $2,736 per vial. I suppose, especially if you only have one manufacturer making a drug, you own that market, and the price could go right through the ceiling as well. So talk to us a little bit about price controls. Dr. Goodman talks about price controls. Are there price controls by the FDA, or are these contracts that folks who are big customers are entering into in order to have some control over the prices that consumers pay? That's usually a good way to make sure consumers are not gouged, is by having a long-term contract. Any of you can answer that. Dr. Fox, you're shaking your head.
Thanks, Senator Peters. You know, I will say that you're exactly right with the contracting. You know, the reason why hospitals can't pay 10 times the amount for a drug next week is because we will still only get paid our capitated rate that has been locked in for years. And so the insurance and the way that we pay for healthcare in this country really doesn't allow for prices to change every day like at the gas station.
Anybody else? Dr. Goodman?
Well, again, I'm going to sound like I'm repeating myself. This is in the report that you all put together, which I think is a very good description of the problem. And what your own report says is this is a market where people compete only on price. And I just want to say again, if buyers and sellers only compete on price and nothing else, we're going to get a race to the bottom of all the other features of the product, including reliability. And what I mean by reliability is, you know, the product is there when you need it. And if you sacrifice reliability, you're going to have shortages. And so if I could just take Mark Cuban's plant, for an example, what could you all do to make sure that Mark Cuban is successful with his US-based plant. You could allow him to say, look, the FDA can come by my plant any day of the week, drop of the hat, no prior announcement, and inspect my facility. That doesn't happen in India, doesn't happen in China. So I'm held to a higher safety standard than those guys overseas. And furthermore, I'm going to make sure, I'm going to invest in reliability, so when you come to what does he call it, cost plus drugs, when you come to cost plus drugs online, it's going to be there when you need it. And so if he could say those kinds of things to his consumers, he would be competing in the right way.
So you're saying if the FDA is preventing
Yes.
companies from saying, well,
Yes.
is that accurate? Dr. Schumann, you can't assess the quality of a drug? There's not information because the FDA just simply doesn't allow you to have the information?
I can't answer the regulatory question. I defer to Dr. Fox. I will say we, as individual doctors and institutions, do not have any way of gauging quality. And the answer for that, I believe Dr. Fox is about to tell us.
Thank you. That's true. Because there's no requirement for any company to list which company even made the drug, where it was made, the sources of raw material, there's no way to assess which company has a good quality record and which company has a bad quality record.
That's a lack of transparency. That's not the
It
FDA
is.
saying you
No,
can't
no, no.
say it.
It's well, FDA can't share that information. FDA has the information, but legally they can't share
They have the information about all these drugs,
most of it.
but they're just not sharing it.
Correct. And Congress could change the labeling law to require drug companies to disclose that. And they could also change the law to allow the FDA to disclose that. But right now, the companies decide what is confidential.
And yet even a lot of the companies don't know where some of this stuff comes from, is my understanding. Is that correct?
Yeah, Chairman Peters, just to add some color to what Dr. Fox shared, when we analyze labels, only 3% of labels actually listed who the active ingredient manufacturer is. So there's very little information in the public domain about who makes these drugs.
But does the company know? That just the company knows and the FDA knows, you're telling me? Or we don't know because that's just not really tracked?
Well, the finished dose manufacturer that purchases the active ingredient will know who the active
So they will know. Do they provide that information to the FDA and the FDA is just not telling anybody?
Yeah, Senator, I'd have to, the FDA has certain confidentiality requirements, so that bind them.
So there's also, the report shows that there are multiple layers of manufacturing processes, but that can also create false appearance that there's actually diversity in the suppliers. I think all of you have touched on this. And I think there are 12 FDA-approved manufacturers, fludarabine, which is the one I mentioned here earlier, a critical drug for treating childhood and adult cancers, but only a handful of those approved are actually supplying the drug. So it looks like there's a lot of diversity, but there really isn't. There's just a couple companies out there. That's lack of transparency. Talk to me about that, why that's a problem, Dr. Fox?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I can look and it looks like there are maybe 6 or 7 suppliers of this product. No problem if we have a shortage because the other companies might be able to make up the difference. But when all of those companies are actually getting their product from just 1 or 2 sources, then we have a false sense of security. And all of that information in your report, which is fantastic, is really not publicly available to anyone at a hospital to do that level of research.
But it is available to the FDA. They have all of that information.
It is, but I don't believe that they can access it well. A lot of that information is buried in PDFs, and it can change. They only get the information once a year as a snapshot in time.